but rather a landscape of possibilities for knowing. The essays taken together are a study of the positions scholars and activists find available for them, which open up new possibilities of conversation about what it is we are looking at or why we should look at it again with a new set of eyes. Decoloniality here stands for a lexicon of reorientation, an attempt to reassess the conditions of knowing Eastern Europe and positions from which such knowledge is made, knowing the place to be deeply implanted already in a number of histories and political narratives. Now I would like to briefly discuss the method of selecting authors. The vinyl selection was based on the authors' availability to participate in the webinars. I have known most of the authors for a long time and have engaged with them on several occasions. I requested them to recommend authors they deem relevant for the debate, thus employing a sort of snowballing method. From the outset, the idea was not to provide an overarching contribution, but to begin crafting a space to contemplate the vocabulary we employ to discuss these issues. In this pilot, my aim was to cover four main focuses. Concepts addressing the complexity of processes in Eastern Europe, such as transcoloniality by Zoltan Ginelli, restless history by Zhivka Valjevičarska, unequal Europes by Manuela Boatcă, and intimate colonialization by Ovidiu Ticendalealu. The second focus pertains to concepts addressing racism and racialization. For instance, the concept Our Raceless Region by Piero Reggepi, Drunken Whites presented by Jelena Savić, Performative Solidarity by Ivana Pražić, Peripheral Self by Daniela Majstorović, and the concept Lived Solidarity by Emina Bužinkić. Another significant focus in this volume explores alternative models during socialism along with their ambivalences and potentials in contemporary context. Ana Sladojević Anti-Colonial Museum is an example of this. Čarna Brković, Decentering Humanitarianism, Bojana Videkanić, Non-Aligned Modernism, Lukasz Stanek, Socialist World-Making. Lastly, this volume covers concepts addressing coloniality of capitalism, including techno-imperialism by Erin McElroy and Disavowal by Veda Popovici. Of course, these categories are not divided with a precise line. Issues do overlap and interact with each other. But to come back to the issue of the lexicon once more, why publish the lexicon now? As I explained in the introduction, the lexicon is an archive of multiple voices and perspectives, anti-racist, post-colonial, decolonial, feminist, anti-capitalist, and as such, refuse a normative relation to lexicography. Lexicons, after all, bear histories of violent colonial modernizations as well as alternative socialist modernizations. Here, instead, the work is to build upon a deep history of counter-lexicons that point to reclaiming collective power of knowledge, of knowing the world against the grain of dominant political economy of meaning-making. Among many important things that make my interest in engaging with this project of decoloniality, I would like to underline one. In parallel with many contradictions that inhabit the project of decoloniality in Eastern Europe, anti-capitalism appears to be a significant factor in the region when engaging with decoloniality, owing to its socialist heritage. I view this as a potential contribution to post-socialist, post-colonial approaches that often overlook these intersections. This perspective could significantly articulate a new way of rethinking contemporary imperialism, neocolonialism, coloniality, and relevant processes of accumulation. To do that, it is important not only to decolonize space of Eastern Europe, which should be our primary task, but to decolonize project of decoloniality to include perspectives coming from the geography that some call Global East. In conclusion, I'd like to share a few words about the future of this project. A unique challenge for us also lies in translating the decolonial discourse across the different languages we utilize. That's why we've dedicated our efforts to translating the lexicon into languages of the region. We have prepared the Serbian version, translated by Irena Šantevska, which is in preparation at the moment, and a Hungarian version translated by Laszlo Lankas and Zoltán Ginelli, which with redactions by Zoltán Ginelli that is currently in preparation. We hope there will be interest in translating it into other East European languages, and to facilitate that, we are offering the book for free. This book is published open access, which is of exceptional importance to all of us, as we believe that the knowledge should be free. To further this process towards the conclusion of work on this pilot, I invited Olivera Jokic and Zoltán Ginelli to engage with this volume, and they contributed with their invaluable precision and attention to detail. We initiated a dialogue to continue this venture together. However, due to availability and the personal circumstances, I carried forward this work with Olivera Jokic and Huda.org. Over the past few months, we have been working to create the conditions to organize the second round of webinars and envision volume 2 of this lexicon. Significant changes have occurred in the time-space continuum while producing this volume. The full invasion of Ukraine, acceleration of climate crisis, and the crisis of the cost of living are just the major ones among them. We do not conceive this project with the aim of covering all national perspectives from Eastern Europe. Instead, our intention is to create space for reflection on contemporary and historical practices. This includes employing the notion of colonialism and decoloniality to discuss diverse relations, domination, of subordination, and as a tool for articulating different forms of violence and liberation. The work of lexicon making continues every day beyond the boundaries of this project. In recent months, some of the authors have plotted new important concepts to discuss some of the potential pitfalls and gaps in particular concepts. For instance, the notion of indigenization of non-alignment has been explored by Anna Sladojević in the process of engaging with the work of Bojana Videkanić and the notion that she proposed non-aligned modernism. Finally, I want to say that my hope for this project is still the same. I hope that this helps to set up decoloniality in Eastern Europe as a field of inquiry with which to reflect on our own positions and imagine different paths towards our insurrectionary futures. That's all for me for now, and I'm eager to engage with all of you on these critical topics. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Anna. Just wanted to share with everybody that we will have about 50 minutes for discussion after all of the presentations. Manuela, please go ahead. You need to unmute, Manuela.
I thought I did. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for having me, and thank you for spotlighting this lexicon after publication. I'm very happy that we get to present these projects again in a smaller format, because we had kind of a preview about 1.5 years ago, which is what I went back to when I knew that this was happening, to see what we were preparing and presenting last time. I'm going to share the screen, because then we had a very organized way of presentation, starting with a slide provided for each and every concept, which I found not only very nicely crafted, but also looking back, the fact that the date was on it for every slide of the different seminars is telling today, because at least the one slot where I presented was on February 19th, 2022, and that is less than a week before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And this is not only a metaphor, but also a very kind of solid evidence of how the notion of Eastern Europe itself is dynamic, and the notion of how far east of a proposed core of Europe, the east of it is something that is shifting and changing and being negotiated constantly. And this is something that I was looking at in the initial formulation of Unequal Europes, but this is something that, as Anna put it, is impossible to pin down. It cannot be in a lexicon that is once and for all done, but because it is constantly in shift. And so the notion of unequal Europes that I've been working on for a while really takes inspiration from a critique of such projects, be them the West or Europe, that have been voiced from different parts of the global South, or the periphery more specifically. And the one concept that I'm engaging with comes from Edouard Clisson, Martinican scholar, discussing how the West is not in the West specifically, but it's a project. It cannot be a place because it has to do with the way the West is imagined as a horizon and as a possibility, as a potential, so to say. And not only does that go for Europe, but I want to argue in my understanding of how many unequal Europes there are, the fact that especially the east of Europe has tended to be a constant project, a work in progress, and has tended through the different ways of being othered to constitute a problem, which does not kind of expiate it from its own role in producing otherness and hierarchies and partaking of positions of privilege. And because this lexicon was being understood and imagined as kind of an artistic project together with an intellectual, activistic, and scholarly project, I was very happy to be able to discuss in detail some visual material, one of which had to do with the maps being produced by the European Commission already in what was called the Eastern Enlargement of the European Union back in 2004, where basically the color coding of different parts of Europe that started with yellow being the existing members of the European Union in 2004, then the 10 countries that were supposed to join in 2004, the Eastern European enlargement basically presented in blue, and the ones that had been denied accession in 2004, principally Romania and Bulgaria, but also Turkey, were represented in purple, although their history of negotiating accession were very different. Romania and Bulgaria had a promise to join in 2004, but had been postponed to 2007 when they did join. But Turkey had been trying to become a EU member since 1986, and as we know today is still very far away from that status. And we see here that there's no vision, there's no understanding of maybe Ukraine or Georgia becoming part of that project. And it's not that much or not that long ago that this project was being discussed. But so this is the 2004 snapshot. And another 2004 snapshot was done right after the accession of the 10 Eastern European countries, in which the whole of happy new united European Union was now all of it yellow, plus some shades of gray, which was not a good joke to make, but is kind of part of the way the shades are being imagined here. Basically, the rest that was not the European Union was some shade of gray, but the darker, the better. So you'd want to be actually yellow if you could, but a darker shade of gray meant Romania and Bulgaria were now closer to joining, as was Croatia, that had become a candidate to accession. And then Turkey had kind of faded away from the dark gray, and yeah, as we know, for a reason. Now, this is connected with a lot of things, but it's also connected to something that caught my attention much later than the time that I was thinking about the location of Eastern Europe on this map, which is the fact that Europe's and the European Union member states' colonial possessions outside of the European continent were also represented in yellow. They're very much up there in the upper right angle of or rectangle of the map, but they're almost never to this day included in discussions of what it means to be European, or what it means to be white, or what the achievements of supposed achievements of Europe have to do with the fact that these are also part of an integral, not only history, but present of Europe, because these places are colonized up till today. So what I was looking at was something that has been criticized from the perspective of other parts of Europe. Namely, this is a cover of a book by Roberto Dainotto called Europe in Theory, where Dainotto is trying to rethink Europe from another point of view, from the south of it, or from what derogatorily has been called the PIGS countries, the opposite of the BRICS, the opposite of the supposedly solid, up and coming kind of developing countries. The PIGS being the ones that were constantly under suspicion of being financially insoluble and so on and so forth, endangering the European project. And the cover of the book is basically centered around a white Christ figure being looked upon by, as we can tell, especially if we know the book, elderly Italian ladies, making the centrality of Christianity for Europe especially salient. That shows us that basically this understanding of Europe as a coherent project can only be questioned, if not even ridiculed, as part of a legacy of social theory, but also political discourse, which has long operated with a version, a very provincial, very sublimated, I even call it sanitized version of European history, in which neither the experience and the history of the east of Europe, nor most of the experience of the south of Europe and its history and present, meaning, so from which they are missing, right? Meaning what is missing is colonialism, what is missing is imperialism, and a lot of the implications that would kind of tie these histories together. So what that led me to was something that is maybe counterintuitive in the understanding of a decolonial project, which is an attempt at classification, but not classification for the sake of pinning things down, but for the sake of making sense of how this discourse of an apparently coherent Europe operated. And this is what I ended up calling unequal Europes. Basically, a discourse that around the time that the Iberian colonizers, Spain and Portugal, started declining from their economic and political hegemonic position in Europe around the beginning of the 20th century, they were positioned as outside of the now rising heroic Europe that was represented primarily by
own independence. So that's.
Sorry? I'll be in a minute.
A little bit? Yeah. Oh, I absolutely.
Who is this?
It's a participant. I muted them because I'm a co-host, so I can do that. All right. So the Iberian colonizers were kind of declining from the position of a hegemon, but only became what I called decadent Europe from the perspective of the new hegemon. First, it was Holland, then it was France and England becoming the core, both economically and politically, of the colonizing core of the world system. But also at the same time, the producers of the discourse of Europe as the triumphant, the civilizer, the developed, the kind of pinnacle of modernity. And from that point of view, it was also the part of Europe that never got to be the colonizer, but not for want of not for lack of wanting so, the east of Europe, mainly represented, but not just kind of characterized by the southeast of Europe or the Balkans, being seen as at most reproducing the discourse of Europeanness, striving for whiteness, striving for modernity, but never quite getting there. And in terms of the economic position, it was a semi-peripheral position, both for the so-called epigonal Europe. This comes from the Greek epigon, so the one kind of heir, the one follower that never quite measures up, and a semi-peripheral position on the point of, on the place of decadent Europe, so the Iberian colonizers, which still leaves the ones that were striving for Europeanness in terms of being nostalgic for it, and those that had never attained it in different positions in the reproduction of coloniality. While the Iberian colonizers were had a founding role in making coloniality happen through the colonization of the Americas. And obviously, heroic Europe had been central in it. Epigonal Europe had very much been complicit in the racial hierarchies that underlay coloniality, as well as in the migration and the exploitation processes that the heroic and decadent Europe had put forward. And last but not least, the colonial positions of Europe still today are part of these mapping of Europe, but in a way, from the point of view of a discourse that is very much geared from the perspective of heroic Europe, these are forgotten Europes. French Guiana or the British Virgin Islands or other parts of the Netherlands or France that are still colonized today are forgotten Europes in this understanding, not because the population who lives in these territories has forgotten that they live in Europe, they very much know that, but they are actively forgotten in a discourse that produces Europeanness as something that only happens in the continent, that is primarily or desirably white and Christian. And if we included the population of these primarily non-white populations, the understanding of Europe as white and Christian and located on the European continent would just implode. So we need all of these perspectives to come back in an understanding of Europe before we can even discuss how to decolonize Europe as a notion and how to arrive at a notion of Europe that is not, and not going to be able to get into details here, but is not a coherent notion, but what I called a creolized one. I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Manuela. You had almost 3 extra minutes because Manuela is going to leave us after 60 minutes. So I thought that's okay. And I hope that you find time to join us again.
I'll try, but also I can answer questions in the chats before I leave.
Yeah, please feel free to type your question and yeah, now, and I will read them later on if it is for the other speakers. Zhivka.
Hello. Hi, everyone. And I want to thank Anna. Just give me a second here. Okay. I want to thank Anna for organizing this and for Professor Fazil Moradi for also inviting us to kind of continue this conversation and this project in a lot of ways and to reflect on our kind of relationship between them. In particular, kind of, it's very important to forge these relationships between the East, what Anna has called and others have called the global East and the global South. And I think that this is a very meaningful project towards the kind of further decolonization of our histories and our historiographies. My own work and my own sort of contribution to this project of kind of further decolonization of our historiographies deals with the place of 20th century socialism and its contribution to anti-colonial and anti-fascist and anti-capitalist history in a larger global picture. And I have proposed to think of it as a kind of restless history. A restless history is not a concept or a term, or it's more something, it's more of a way in which we can think about East European historical socialism in the current moment. In the last 3 decades, the material culture of the socialist past has been stigmatized and destroyed and erased and turned into a resource for capitalist accumulation and extraction in unforeseeable ways. And in Bulgaria, this process has become particularly intense after the country joined the European Union, as Bulgarian society kind of reimagined itself as a Western and a European nation. Here in Bulgaria, where I'm currently located in the city of Plovdiv, as well as in other East European countries, Europeanization has become almost synonymous with decommunization. an agenda often pushed with the help of vaguely worded legislation that criminalizes in absurd ways the cultural, material, and symbolic legacies of an entire historical period, that of the evil communist regime. So in the face of unrelenting right-wing, neo-fascist, racist, and patriarchal forces in the East European region during the post-socialist years, I think we need to rethink the role of socialism and the socialist past, as it offers a complex historical experience that can be both a source of resistance and learning. First, I want to say something about the socialist past in the Western imagination and how it's present in Western left-wing and also liberal sort of accounts. So in the West, the East European region and the former socialist world is often absent from the global histories of progressive social movements. And this absence is the effect of a continuous dismissal of the socialist countries as they were proclaimed to be failures by the Western liberals as well as the Western left. And even in their most radical formulations, the left in Western Europe and the United States has dismissed from afar the socialist societies and governments as totalitarian and authoritarian. Yet most liberals and leftists in the West who consider these countries a failure never set foot in them and never experienced them directly. Speaking none of our languages, Western researchers never attempted independent historical or ethnographic research of the socialist period. In other words, the Western left never took the social realities of socialism on their own terms. Their imaginaries converge with colonial and Orientalist phobias of the East, seen as a vast, vaguely defined region, a place with backward dictatorial top-down governments, a region populated by people who could not govern themselves, therefore needing authoritarian regimes or outside saviors. Even post and decolonial critiques of the global dynamics from the 1980s onwards, which have recentered the formerly colonized countries in the global South, have mostly neglected the role of the socialist countries in the anti-colonial liberation struggles and in the forging of global worlds resistant to Western powers and hegemony. Focused mainly on first world and third world geopolitical dynamics, the post-colonial critiques from the 80s and the 90s rarely mention the socialist countries, rendering invisible the geographies of the so-called second world and subsuming them under the frameworks of Western modernity. A recent body of work has returned to these histories to challenge existing narratives. Studying the relations between the second and the third worlds from the 50s to the end of the 80s, or the relations of the former socialist countries to the newly independent countries from the global South, we have begun the collective effort of rethinking the political dynamics between the socialist world and the formerly colonized countries against dominant Cold War tropes and binaries. This work has opened wider horizons for the historical revision that go beyond the dominantly Eurocentric and Western historiographies of the era. Thus, displacing East-West and North-South axes of analysis, we have begun to see the alternative routes and locations where decolonial politics with anti-capitalist visions emerged and thrived during the socialist era. I want to say something about the complexity of history and socialist history in particular. And I want to say that socialism is only part of the complex histories of Eastern Europe and the Balkans. And in particular, I am working from the context of the Balkans and Bulgaria. And we should always keep in mind that the colonial worldview cannot tolerate the complexity of its other. For example, throughout its modern history, Bulgaria has been ambiguously positioned on the cusp of three different historical and political contexts: the Ottoman Empire, the Soviet Socialist Project, and the current European Union regime. Situated on the margins of these geopolitical formations, in the shadow of their historical legacies or political influences, its historical experience casts a unique light on the worlds in which it is enmeshed, but to which it never entirely belongs. Because of the layering of these multiple histories, the Bulgarian and Balkan contexts are quite dense. In them, entwined and colliding worlds coexist in ways that create zones of illegibility or discord that can be too much to unpack, so the region is prone to marginalization and simplification. Let us remember that this is one of the ways in which colonial power works, by flattening the histories and cultures of the people to be controlled and dominated, by simplifying, ignoring, and erasing them, and by forcing them into simple binaries and oppositions. But our history always reemerges in unruly and defiant ways. Geography here itself becomes a guiding methodology for post and decolonial rethinking by taking as its starting point the peripheries and the margins. Often at the thresholds of multiple worlds, our marginal geographies contain dense historical and cultural layers. They have the power to disrupt the coherence of homogeneous and monolithic forms of thinking. And I want to say something about socialist history in the context of Europeanization, very briefly, and perhaps in closing. The turn to neoliberal and right-wing politics in the post-socialist countries is an effect of the demise and devaluation of the socialist worlds in the 20th century. How we read and mobilize the history of 20th century socialisms in Eastern Europe and the rest of the world then becomes a crucial question. In this context, we have proposed alternative ways of thinking about the geopolitical and historical legacies of 20th century socialism, not only in Eastern Europe, but also we can speak about global socialisms and their reverberations, the reverberations of 20th century socialism globally. The state socialist projects me and my colleagues have submitted should be acknowledged as a front of resistance to capitalism and as a source of disobedience and insubordination in the face of Western capitalist and colonial projects. They formed open, messy, and intractable environments, discontinuous histories, and resistant geographies, which interrupted or disrupted, however briefly or partially, the flows of capital, as well as the continuity of Western colonial orders. The persistence throughout the 20th century produced a kind of historical and temporal displacement that disrupted the totalizing spatial movement of capitalism and its unified world history. And they reordered the world with a force. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We will come back with more questions, I guess. So now, Anna Sladojević.
Yes, I'm sharing my screen. Can you see it?
Yes.
So thank you, Fazil, very much for this invitation. It is really wonderful to be with all of you today. And I was kindly invited by Anna Vilenica, as the editor of this book, to contribute to this lexicon of decoloniality with the notion of an anti-colonial museum. So I should actually explain why anti-colonial. So it is used here precisely in order to situate the post-Yugoslav region within the wider scope of decolonial thinking, which is something that my predecessors were talking about, but also to point out that not all the regions and not all the institutions can be decolonized in the same way. Hence, anti-colonial also doubles as a decentered counterpart to the word decolonial. It comes out of an attempt to reconnect our current criticism of institutions and cultural representation to particular histories of anti-colonialism, anti-racism, and solidarity, characteristic of the socialist Yugoslavia in the second half of the 20th century. So the context of my work, well, roughly over the last 20 years, was set within the post-Yugoslav space, as you can deduce, and it was in the cultural and political circumstances of a complete erasure of both socialist Yugoslavia and all of its visual and semantic traces, something that Zhivka also touched upon when talking about Eastern Europe. But this particular erasure happened over the 1990s, which was a decade of wars in the post-Yugoslav region. And it was the time of redefinition and re-articulation of new nation states which emerged from the former Yugoslavia. And this violent and traumatic end to one country, that was Yugoslavia, and the subsequent fast-paced liberal capitalist transition detached the culture production from the ideas and from the values of the socialist, of the former socialist state. And this kind of erasure actually continued well into 2000s. So among such visual and discursive traces that have been almost entirely erased and forgotten was the non-alignment. Non-alignment as pertaining to the non-aligned movement of countries, international movement of countries that oppose the bipolar division of the world after the Second World War. However, such erasure of non-alignment was not solely characteristic of the post-Yugoslav space. It happened on a global level after 1989. And however, non-alignment was an important aspect of Yugoslav international politics, and it was also one important aspect of actually self-image of Yugoslavia as well. And this was prominent in the 1960s, 1970s, and went on during 1980s as well, because the first conference of the non-aligned movement took place in Belgrade in 1961. What is interesting, let me just see if this will move to the next slides. Yes. What is interesting is that one such historical remnant finds its place in Belgrade, which is the Museum of African Art, the Veda and Dr. Zdravko Pečar collection, which was founded in Belgrade in 1977. Well, perhaps you know, perhaps you do not know that I started my career as a professional curator at this very particular museum, and that was roughly at the beginning of 2000s. And at the time, it was a rather small and it was perceived as quite an insignificant institution that not many people took interest in. And however, at the time of its opening, it was announced as the only anti-colonial museum exhibiting African art in Europe. So this fact kind of caught my interest. And it actually bothered me so much, you know, to find these traces of anti-colonialism that I did my PhD on the topic of this kind of duality of discourse between the colonial and anti-colonial. So the main topic that I wanted to investigate is, where is this anti-colonial discourse? Because I really couldn't find it within this kind of, let's say, visual repertoire of the museum. So that you can actually see the permanent display, and it hasn't much changed. Well, it hasn't changed at all up to this day. And this is also kind of curiosity about this particular institution. What I have to say, as a professional within the field of African art curating, at the time, later I moved on and became an independent curator. I considered very early on museums to be the way they were construed on the turn of the centuries 19th to 20th, and additionally formulated after the Second World War as inherently imperial institutions. So embedded in the imperial paradigm by the very methodologies, systematizations, and taxonomies. And my main motivation actually for doing this long-term investigation, because I did it over the course of 20 years, of this particular case study was therefore not merely the recuperation of our historical selves, although that is important as well. As Zhivka said, it is important to, in a way, uncover all of these layers and these complexities. But in my case, my first motivation was basically an urge to reflect on and change the ways that I myself, at the time as a curator of African art, was inflicting epistemic violence by repeating the content of the Western-centric art histories, and among them the construed Western-centric field of expertise in the domain of African arts. Now, just let me be clear about this. I do not say this in order to diminish the scope and immense importance of the arts from the African continent and the diaspora, but to point at how the construed field of African art expertise was, and in some ways continues to be, responsible for narrowing down an immensely rich production of the whole continent on a set of typical objects that were used to basically certify this Western-centric expertise and therefore secure the market value of such art. Now, it is a much longer story and more complicated than I have time here to tell. And it is the story of violence towards African arts and of racialization of African and Black authors. But it suffices here to say that my starting point was one of criticism of museums and heritage, normalized as paramount authorities in deeming what the work of art is and where it stands in such hierarchies. And that was my critical point in regard to this museum as well. However, the research on this museum yielded evidence of anti-colonial engagement of the collection founders, Veda Zagorac and Zdravko Pečar, who were also initiators of the museum and the first collectors, let's say, of the museum collection. So there were documents in the form of photographs, recordings, films that narrated different aspects of the Yugoslav anti-colonial dedication. While this recuperated documentation is not enough to make this museum be anti-colonial, in a sense, we can actually say that anti-colonial museum is an oxymoron. However, I actually try to see this kind of anti-colonial discourse not merely actually deposited in the objects, but also how it reflected on the museum constituencies. And this is actually where I located the anti-colonial stance, which I was in search for such a long time. And it is this move from objects to the discourse and with the constituencies that I located the anti-colonial discourse. So people who were constituencies of this museum had the memory of non-alignment. And among them, particularly people of African descent, who continued to live in Yugoslavia, actually in Serbia later on, and for example, whose families were a direct result of such mobility, or people who used to work in African countries, or people who used to collaborate with their colleagues in African countries, and so on. So basically, although I based all of my research on this particular case study, what came out of this research is this anti-colonial museum manifesto. I will not go through all of these bullet points, but if anyone is interested, you can find it on my academia edu page. It is free to download. And basically all of these reflections on where the anti-colonial discourse is yielded this information that anti-colonial museum has to be in some kind of ethical communication amongst ourselves. And what I was particularly happy about is that many of my colleagues from the region, many of the projects of collectives of individual researchers and artists actually embrace this kind of stance. And I believe there is kind of a sense of an agency to such an approach and of empowerment, because by establishing the connection to the affirmative aspects of our past, also informed by our experiences and positionalities, we engage in a dialogue on an equal footing with interlocutors worldwide. And I will just go briefly to some of the examples, and I borrowed this term rehearsals from Ariela Isha Zuley and her Unlearning Imperialism. Because all of these rehearsals, I was actually very happy to recommend manifesto to my colleagues, and they were free to transform it to their needs. And the key to such an emancipated position that I believe we are all striving towards is, in my mind, the ability to remain self-critical and self-reflective toward the epistemic violence we ourselves are inflicting from our own positionalities, rather than concentrating solely on what we perceive to be the injustice done to us. And most of all, I think that it reminds us to choose well whom do we want to think with, and how we can actually create such possibilities for a joint effort and of thinking and acting that goes beyond the existing and normalized institutional confines. So that would be my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So now, Zoltan, you here? Yeah.
Just give me a sec. Okay. Okay, can you see the slides?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, start right away. A few words before I start. Many thanks to Anna Vilenica and Oliver Jokic for their incredible patience and diligence in this project. So I want to give some special thanks to them. Actually, I was co-editor, and I entered after the workshop and the organization, the selection of the text. And I want to emphasize again that this book should appear in Hungarian too. So the idea was to make this book accessible to the Eastern European region. Also, another comment on Ukrainian comments on this book, that there's a lack of Ukrainian voices. This book actually was conceived and devised before the war. So this project was planned as to be continued, and it's just a starting of a dialogue, okay? So I'm looking forward to this dialogue. And my concept of transcoloniality will be actually a geographical approach to connect different geographical contexts. So from my position as a critical geographer and a global historian, when we center on Eastern Europe as a region, the key idea is, I think, how to translate the experiences and histories and the local knowledge of coloniality and racialization to other contexts, because otherwise the key challenge would be to contest any kind of essentialization or exceptionalism of the region. So having said this, I think that before I start with the concept and the historical context, the case study which I want to talk about, I think that the main challenge is that there has been a colonial turn in Eastern Europe in the past decade. Not just interest in decolonial framing, but also coloniality as a concept and decoloniality as a politics and the rhetoric has been highly politicized, often hijacked by political powers. What is often bypassed by current discussions of Eastern European decoloniality is that Hungary has been pivotal in developing an anti-colonial discourse of revolt against the West, in this case, in a conservative liberal political turn, which really connects to identification related to dividing the European Union into colonizer and non-colonizer countries. So countries with having no significant heritage of colonial history. However, the opposition has also mirrored this discourse. So there's this discourse of Chinese and Russian colonialism. So we can see that this has been really a strong political capital. So any critical scholar should have a contest and try to translate the different political articulations of grasping onto or sometimes even hijacking coloniality or decoloniality as a politics in the region. I haven't seen much of these translations or these discussions, so I hope that this lexicon would be one, a way to start these discussions throughout the region. Okay, however, all actors have remained West-centric, mimicking and importing hegemonic US political theater and US political, stakes. In many cases, this kind of West-centric approach obstructs any meaningful discussion of local historical relations to global colonialism. So even decoloniality is a problem if it is just considered as an imported framework, even if it is an important framework of resistance, like look at the Roma Lives Matter label, for example, which tried to mirror the Black Lives Matter, motto. So the other important thing, I think, is we need to contest the nationalist victimization, which feeds on long existing nationalist compartmentalization of historical consciousness. So there are only nationalist histories of colonial history, separated and not connected. And there's also a very dominant discourse of Eastern European exceptionalism, which builds onto the peripheral East as something that's very distinct from the Atlantic version of colonial history. So basically my concept of transcoloniality, which actually builds on literature that has been there in post-colonial studies since the mid or late 1990s, in the very Anglophonic and Western literature, builds on mostly these authors, also one author, Boatcă, included in the lexicon, is basically about to look at how colonial projects and various types of colonies were actually interconnected and informed each other in global history. So looking at, for example, internal and external colonialisms separately as a typology would be, I think, a wrong approach to looking at global colonial histories, because in many cases, these informed each other or were structurally interconnected. Of course, also this concept of transcoloniality, which looks at transit, so looks at circulation. It also looks at translations, so how different colonial projects or contexts translated their positions to each other or informed each other. So what was the translated process? It's actually also about transformation. So this is a transformative process, which can also be used as a form of resistance. So for example, Olivia Harrison's work shows how these interconnected colonial projects also created interconnected anti-colonial resistance. It would be very important to look at Eastern European history from this perspective, how Eastern Europe was embedded into global colonialism, and look at these circulations of colonial knowledge, also forms of anti-colonial resistance. This is actually something that we started as an exhibition project. So this concept, my question comes from the transperiphery concept that we used in the Transperiphery Movement exhibition, which was exhibited in Budapest and also in Kyiv in Ukraine just before the war in October. So this showed for us, we created this with Esther Szakács, how Eastern European, to show the Eastern European historical links to global racialization, global anti-colonialism, or the non-aligned movement in the global South. So how can we tell a shared history of the region with the global South? Now, I will start with the historical case that was presented in this volume, which was actually about how German-Hungarian settlers ended up in Latin America as colonists. And this story is about these overlapping colonial subjectifications and also projects. So first we start with the Habsburg internal colonialism of populating or repopulating the lands of former Ottoman rule within the Hungarian kingdom. And many of these colonists were Swabian Germans from southern Germany who spoke German, and actually due to German hegemony maintained to speak German and maintain the German identity. Interestingly, this colonial project was informed by North American expansion to the Western colonial frontier. So there was a trans-colonial circulation of colonial technologies and ideas of settlements. So look at the right below on the right, this map of these planned settlements. So this is the same idea of rectangular shaped settlements were taken from the Western frontier. Another element of this story is the Hungarian, that despite this multi-ethnic composition of the Habsburg Empire, throughout the 19th century, there emerged a nationalist conception of a racial landscape. So this land is actually the Hungarian land, a land of the steppe, of the nomadic people. We came actually from Asia to settle in this land, the Hungarians. So this discourse was informed by a colonial landscape painting concepts and images taken from North African desert landscapes, for example. And by the mid-19th century, especially due to the independence war against the Habsburg, this idea really strengthened as also contrasting the Hungarian landscape against, for example, the mountainous regions of the Balkans, which was conceived as something to be colonized by Hungarians to overcome these barriers. But also, Hungarians were racialized as Asians due to this national conception in the Americas when they arrived there as migrants. So Hungarians were racialized as the Huns, as the Mongols, as the Asian barbarians in North America. And this will be something which will be translated in the South American Pampas as something that would enable Hungarians to enable the Latin American landscape to be fit for Hungarian settlement. So these nationalist conceptions of settlement will translate through colonial circulations. So Eastern Europe was an arena of various colonial projects. One dominant one was German colonialism, And there you can see on the left a map, which was also used by the Nazis in ideas of colonizing Eastern Europe. Hungarians were also subjects to this. Germans were mapping German populations as colonial subjects, and this ignited fears of Hungarian indigeneity or Hungarian race as something to contest German empire, but also the threat of the Slavic Sea, right? After the Second World War, these Germans were resettled to Germany. These Germans were resettled to Germany even after communist rule. So many of these Germans living in these areas actually settled in Latin America, especially after the 1920s, due to the racial quotas in the USA against mostly racialized Eastern Europeans. These local racial states in South America, accepted Eastern Europeans, and actually there's this huge wider history of late 19th century emigration from Eastern Europe to the Americas, substituting for the lack of work of a subjugated working force, labor force, due to Black abolitionism. So due to the fact that the plantation economy was terminated in that form, there was a need for Eastern European migrants. Okay, this example was a specific settlement founded by Swabian Germans who were actually coming from Hungary, Jaraguá do Sul, in southern Brazil. You can see some
30 seconds.
Yes, okay, I will try to finish. So these are some images of these settlers who were actually Hungarians, but some of them German Hungarians. And my idea of bringing in transcoloniality are twofold. So one is that there were these competing racial and colonial states in South America, in Germany, and also in Hungary, competing for these people as colonial subjects. Hungarians were trying to, various actors in Hungary were trying to organize the Hungarian diaspora in the interwar period. The Second World War put an end to this trajectory, but it wasn't clear at that time whether this could be successful. So there were various colonial visions of the Hungarian settler who brought his national identity from Hungary and could root as a colonist in South America and maintain his nationalist identity. The second is actually the translative process of this transcolonial adventure. So here you could see a few more images, and also the fact that many of these people came from areas which were detached after the Trianon Treaty. So these people were oftentimes not considered as Hungarian citizens, so the Hungarian state had trouble organizing them. There were also debates of having these people coming back to the national body of Hungary, and also previous in the late 19th century, they discussed this word that people should come back from Hungary to populate the Balkans as colonists, because they would be closer to the national body. So I wanted to show through this chapter, and this is what I will finish, is that there was also a translative aspect to this, as Hungarian concepts of nation were transformed through these colonial ventures. For example, colonial folklore was strongly impacted by this kind of travel to the Americas and settling as a colonist. This is one example from a folk song, which became an American folk song.
Zoltan, we need to stop here because.
Okay, thank you. And my last sentence would be that today, governments are turning back to their post-socialist diaspora politics to the region. Interestingly, would offer an approach to creolize nationalist histories, because through this process of turning to the diaspora in Latin America, they are uncovering our colonial histories of Hungary. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You had the records, Zoltan, you had 14 minutes. So now we are with Erin. Do you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, great. Let me just share my screen. Okay, great. Yeah, well, thank you so much again for the invitation to share this time with you all today. Thanks to Anna and also to Fazil for making this happen. Zoltan too. It's actually, I think the order of the presentations works really well because I'm going to be thinking a little bit about Silicon Valley and the US and the Americas. So it kind of builds interestingly enough of the sort of transatlantic focus that Zoltan was just talking about. My chapter in the Lexicon anthology is on techno-imperialism. And I should, I guess, mention that in other work, I focus more specifically on what I'm calling Silicon Valley imperialism. I'm using them slightly interchangeably here. But in general, I'm arguing that techno-imperialism and Silicon Valley imperialism build upon US imperialism, but also specifically home in on the imaginative and also material transformations that Western and US technology imparts. And also in other work, I've focused on California and the US, where native Ohlone lands that were colonized first by Spanish missionaries and then by Anglo gold rushers and then US empire. I look at the history of how that evolved to become Silicon Valley during the Cold War. So just to kind of give that context, some of that thinking informs the way that I'm thinking about Silicon Valley. But in my lexicon contribution, I wanted to focus more on the impact of imperialism in Romania and post-socialist Romania, where I have spent time living and organizing and visiting off and on for 15 or so years. And so I'm going to just begin with my contribution. And so it begins in 2018 when the mayor of Cluj in Romania and Transylvania announced the introduction of what he called a public robot, which he named Antonia, as part of the city's newfound status as the Silicon Valley of Eastern Europe. And really since about 2010, I mean, there are sources even earlier, Cluj has been labeled the sort of Silicon Valley of Eastern Europe. And although Antonia proved to only be a computer program and didn't have this robotic stock image displayed in the press, she was nevertheless envisioned to become the first public robot mayoral servant to sort of herald in this new smart city vision that Cluj was trying to embrace at the time and still is. And interestingly, even this year, I didn't get to write about this in my contribution, but the prime minister of Romania invented this entity called One, where he worked with these AI technologists to create apparently the first ever government-supported mayoral or not, presidential prime minister servant. And the idea is that One is supposed to capture social media data and other sort of data that exists online and then reflect what people want back to the government so the government knows. And these are all very strange entities, but what I think they reflect is that there's this ongoing desire in Cluj, but also in Romania more broadly, and also in other cities and parts of Eastern Europe to reflect this sort of technological arrival or having become the Silicon Valley of Eastern Europe, or to become a smart city or to become Siliconized. And so I'm really interested in my work why and how this desire emerges, and also how it benefits Western tech companies, and also how it imparts gentrification locally. So in Cluj, rents have risen and evictions too, as the city becomes quote unquote smart. Numerous poor and working class people, especially Roma residents, have been squeezed out and pushed to the wastelands. Sometimes people end up unhoused, and sometimes they're banished altogether from the city. And this has to do in part with property restitution, which has transformed much of Eastern Europe as properties that were nationalized and made public during socialism become reprivatized in the name of transitional justice through this very anti-communist lens. But also in cities like Cluj, what is at play is this process of Siliconization, where you can see here this company that was a Romanian computer factory, EBS, during socialism is now this outsourcing branch for actually a Japanese tech company called Entity Data. But there are other companies owned by Western European and also US firms all across the city, mostly engaging in outsourcing. And so keeping this in mind, I want to consider how techno-imperialism works, and let me switch slides. Okay. And how it's really upon the bedrock of socialist factories, even computer factories, that a lot of the outsourcing today takes place. There's a place that was called the Red Flag, which was a butchery that opened in 1947. That's now called the Oxygen Mall. The German iQuest building sits upon the ruins of the Fleckera textile factory. Adjacent to where another German multinational, Bosch, is developing a new campus. Meanwhile, branches of US landlord tech companies sit upon a former beer plant, today known as the Office. And so in this sense, Cluj's smart urbanization is being built upon the very infrastructure of socialist modernity in order to outsource labor. Yet by only reading technology or technological development through this lens, other histories of technology and techno-urbanism disappear. And so, oops, sorry, I'm skipping ahead. So interestingly, during socialism, Romania excelled at hardware development and manufactured tons of what were called third generation computers. But I think what's more interesting is that actually underground, a lot of deviant DIY computing was happening, especially the cloning of computers. And this also was happening in the former Yugoslavia, Ukraine, and Bulgaria, Poland, all over the region. But essentially, people were cloning licenses of Western computers to create their own computers, in part because nobody could afford Western computers, and also so that people could have new ways to engage with technology and develop their own resources. But it was after 1989 that state socialist factories were bought up by real estate speculators, and then companies like IBM and Hewlett-Packard, Microsoft, and Oracle, all from the US, swept in to absorb former tech workers, embracing Cold War grammars of socialist backwardness to justify Western salvation. And this is a New York Times article from 1989, where Ronald Reagan was proclaimed that the Goliath of totalitarianism would be brought down by the David of the microchip. And he said that Western technologies were the oxygen of the modern age. They were the electric beams that were blowing through the Iron Curtain as if it were lace. So in other words, there was this idea, right, that the Cold War would be won through technology. But nevertheless, deviant DIY techno practices continued. Bootlegging was a very common practice in the 90s and even to the 2000s in Romania, as was independent internet networking, again, in part because people couldn't afford Western media software, but also because people already had these skills that they developed during socialism. And so a retro computing expert in Cluj told me that today the city's tech boom isn't being led necessarily by Western firms, but rather by a particular generation of young people, or actually millennials at this point, who grew up engaging in technological deviancy. It is these people, he said, who hold the knowledge of outsourcing, the knowledge that outsourcing companies are trying to prey upon and exploit. So the factories that house their parents' industrial work are the factories that these outsourcing ventures sit upon today. And so the West may absorb existent infrastructure, computer factories, wires, knowledge, and more, but it wasn't the West that actually created these. And so while techno-imperialism co-ops underground cyber worlds and instantiates new forms of gentrification, it remains materially corrupted by and dependent upon underground technological knowledge. And so at the same time, the work against tech gentrification is ongoing, led by an array of housing and racial justice collectives, such as Social Housing Now in Cluj and the Common Front for Housing Rights in Bucharest. But there are also groups, there's a group called Shata, who develops open source hardware in order to provide anti-corporate and anti-surveillance alternatives to capitalist technology. And so I conclude my lexicon chapter by suggesting that what's really yet to be determined is, I think, how best the worlds of technological housing and racial justice can come together and forge new futures against the impulses of techno-imperialism. And so I'm hoping that by crafting new spaces of organizing against siliconization, we can begin to decenter Silicon Valley and the West in terms of how we think about technology and how we think about techno futures. And I think if we could do that decentering, a new space would be opened up to manifest futures antithetical to and against techno-imperialism. What these futures will look like remains to be seen, yet arguably the blueprints are already being crafted. And this is an image from a protest against gentrification imposed by the sort of siliconization of Cluj, led by housing activists and the groups of Cash Social Acum, or social housing now, during the pandemic, really calling attention to the hypocrisies that becoming a smart city in parts, particularly upon Roma addictees. And what I love about this image is that they're actually using technology to fight against technologies of displacement. So I'm going to end there and look forward to talking more in the conversation.
Thank you so much, Erin. Thank you, everybody. I think there are 2 questions that is typed there. I'm sure many of you have read these questions, but just I just want to add a question or a thought to this. Anna, you said this is the first public discussion about the book. So you did not have any discussion anywhere in Eastern Europe about the book so far?
No, this is the first public discussion. I mean, this is imagined as discussion forum. So this lexicon emerged from a discussion. So this is now, how to say, a layering of discussion upon discussion. So this has already been discussed before the lexicon has been produced. Yeah, but in terms of presenting the lexicon, it is a first public presentation and discussion about it.
I would like to invite everyone. Now we are in an open discussion session, so you can either type your question or just ask your question or share your thoughts with us yourself. It is. I read the chapters that we have. The chapters that we are discussing today, and it is incredible how a concept or a field of scientific inquiry, such as decoloniality or post-colonial critique, what these concepts or scientific inquiries can do. And that is entering Zhivka's the entire complex questions of histories. How do we engage these histories through these concepts that we have, to the question of museums, or in Jacques Derrida's sense, it will be the entire archive. And that would mean going against the power without a power that is based on the control of the archive or memory. And this shift from the objects to values, and therefore a question of epistemic discourse or epistemic shift, and then the turn to transcoloniality, trying to follow movement of people and as politics, as a political shifts. And then the question of the technoscience and decoloniality. Decoloniality, of course, was not clear in how it applies to, in this particular context, to technoscience or techno-empire, but it is, as a field that I'm aware of, where decoloniality is missing, we are using mostly post-colonial. I'm just wondering about the relevance of decoloniality, not decolonial, in this context, because when I was reading this text, there was not an engagement with the concept of decoloniality. And everything you have said is about decoloniality. That is the question of how trying to inquire into institutionalized knowledges or epistemologies, in this case, imperial epistemology. So I'm just wondering if any one of you have something to say about decoloniality as a concept, and how, whether it's being received in the context that you are researching in. And I'm just saying so we can open up to that. This is our entry point into the importance of the book and the importance of your research focus, which is immense. So any one of you can pick.
If I may, open up, I will just say something about my field of work, which was this idea of a colonial versus anti-colonial discourse in a museum. So when I started, it was based on museum studies, African studies, post-colonial studies, etc. It only became decolonial work once I had this idea that I'm not only kind of decolonizing my approach as an expert in the field of African art, but I'm also, in a sense, decolonizing our past. And this kind of dual vision that I had made it decolonial. Until that point, perhaps it was not so. So I don't know if this, as an example, can actually serve a purpose of defining decoloniality in this context.
Before you continue, there is also a question that connects with this. It's by Elena Dimitriou, who is writing, I would like to inquire into the panel's position regarding, within quotation marks, decoloniality of socialism. Perhaps, Zhivka, this is for you. That is East European decoloniality vis-a-vis the socialist project of the ex-Soviet Union. So you can just take that also into account as you respond.
Of course, and this is perhaps kind of a core question for many of us, is the kind of the socialist experience, because what perhaps unites us is that we have, even though we come from very different contexts, is that we have to contend with a socialist history and with, with particular historical experience of state socialism, which, me myself has, I have been involved in sort of rereading in very different ways, and kind of, rethinking it against totalitarian frameworks and frameworks that cast it in terms of totalitarianism and authoritarianism and as a failed project. And so sort of, because all of us, in one way or another, and I'm speaking for myself, but also like whatever others want to add to this, is that I am a child of socialism, and in ways that has shaped my my worldview in very important ways. And so like, how do we kind of come to terms with that experience, with and with the sort of with our own history in ways that doesn't sort of discard the experience entirely. And so so I'm thinking about how, and kind of similar to Anna's approach and answer to this, is that the socialist past kind of appears in some major ways in my work in particular, and what does it mean to decolonize this past against these erasures, against this kind of devaluation of socialism. And that would be like kind of a decolonial approach to socialism and a methodology, which we, I in particular am very interested in kind of learning from the decolonial methodology, is how to decolonize in terms of, and rethink in terms of kind of working against the devaluation of the socialist experience. And then the other question that I myself, as a historian and like a social and cultural historian of the socialist history in Bulgaria and the Balkans, is to kind of rethink the relationships between the socialist countries and and the global South, and that relationship between anti-colonial liberation struggles in Africa, also the relationships between the socialist countries and the newly independent nation states in the global south. And of course, every country is very different and has its own trajectories when it comes to that, particular sort of politics of forging these relations that were counter-hegemonic and counter against Western hegemony and global capitalism in a lot of ways. And in Bulgaria, we have like a very different kind of sort of relationality with the South, in particular with India and with North Africa and with East Africa and other, which were very political projects of exchanging knowledge and resources and all kinds of things. So I think that, and so I'm just saying that for every country, this is different, and we can, kind of take on very different approaches to recover that lost and forgotten history, which was a very important history in the 60s and the 70s. And I think that the world looked very different, very differently in the 60s and the 70s from the way we can see it now. And others can, of course, join in answering.
Yeah.
That you want to engage also with that.
Okay, sorry, can I jump in then? Okay, so obviously I have a lot of things to say, and I think others are in the same shoes, but this kind of relevance of decoloniality in the region, I think, is also problematic because so my approach from world systems analysis taught me how to look at the structural context and conditions of articulating any type of colonial or racial identification or discourse. So we always have to look at the structural conditions. What are the structural stakes of identifying with a position or articulating some kind of political position in place? Because in the case of decoloniality, oftentimes, as I tried to signal in the introduction of my talk, is about catching up to the West. And then the issue of race and dealing with race and the frameworks of political resistance, of anti-racism, of cultures of anti-colonialism comes from the West. And this kind of West-centrism, I think, is a key issue in Eastern Europe, where both on the far right, right-wing, conservative, leftist or liberal positions are all involved in reproducing this kind of West-centrist epistemology and knowledge. And this is something which also then builds into the fact that decolonialism has become a business in the West. It's also about whitewashing oftentimes. The political debates around wokeism, for example, became although it was originally an Afro-American agenda. So kind of trying to find our place in these discussions would, I think, the best way to address this would be to open up geographically to other contexts throughout the world, to the global South, and so we have to realize that the way that knowledge is structured comes from the hegemonic core. So it really gives us barriers towards building alliances and translations of knowledge to other geographical contexts, which might be beneficial to inform the Eastern European position. And I have something else to say about socialist decoloniality, but to finish this train of thought, I think that the lexicon was really trying to strategically recenter on Eastern European positions, not to reproduce the West-centric knowledge hegemony. So perhaps that's why there was not that much discussion about decoloniality, because oftentimes in literature, in mainstream literature, it has become a theoretical discussion, whereas there has been a lot of empirical work in the past decade coming out from Eastern European relationships, global relationships to the global South, etc., and to countering this kind of anti-communist narratives that Zhivka was addressing. And I think we should focus on these voices and particularly historical experiences before jumping into theoretical debates about decoloniality. So this is my approach.
Thank you. Yeah, Anna, Erin, Anna.
Yeah, I guess I could just jump in and say, yeah, I think it's a really important question. And I mean, maybe in order to talk about decoloniality, we have to always figure out what we mean by coloniality, which is, of course, what all of these presentations are about in different ways. I would just add that it's been interesting to do work in a context, for instance, in California, in the US, where decoloniality means something, I would say, slightly different, in that people say, if you're talking about decoloniality, you have to actually be talking about giving land back to Indigenous peoples whose homes and lands have been colonized for hundreds of years, and people who are still here fighting to reclaim those lands and rematriate culture. But if you take that approach to decoloniality to a place like Eastern Europe, it can become very white supremacist and nativist, and you know, there are different ways that nativity can be very anti-immigrant, and so I think that what that tells me, at least, is that we need to have different lexicons, I suppose, when we talk about coloniality and decoloniality, and that they can't mean the same thing in multiple places. And so, you know, it means decolonizing, I guess, our understanding of decoloniality. And I guess that's an ongoing project. And that's what I love so much about this volume. So, and I think, I mean, Manuela's presentation and Sultan's, really get at, you know, there are so many different imperial histories at work in a place like Eastern Europe. And I know Manuela talks about intra-imperiality. They need to think kind of the simultaneity of multiply existing imperial histories as they continue to inform the present. And I think that is a really important project. And I think Sultan's project gets to it, you know, just because we can look at the impact of whether it's a sort of Soviet imperialism or US imperialism or what have you, or we can look at all sorts of different imperialisms in Eastern Europe. That's not to say that Eastern European countries haven't also engaged in imperial projects. So, you know, it gets very complex.
Yeah, I could maybe add, just like for me, it was about, you know, not being afraid to think in a complex way, and not being afraid of contradictions that emerged in these discussions, because I really believe, you know, when we reach to the point of contradiction, that we are in the right way to learn something. So yeah, I mean, as the Olivera Jokic has already stated in her afterwards, I mean, there is these contradictions that are exploding, you know, like even if you try to compare chapters in this volume, you know, like you have like in one chapter, like something can be like seen as emancipatory, and in another one, it can be an oppression to something else. But you know, like I still really believe that this is a very potent discussion that in Eastern European context brings reflections upon things that can be that were ignored or like looked from one particular point of view for too long. And I also think that in regards of what is happening at this particular moment regarding the discussions of decoloniality and colonialism, in particular instrumentalization, it is even more important to keep this complexity at place.
Thank you. Cici, I see that you have put a question there. Do you want to elaborate on your question? And I also want to invite Elena, if you want to follow up on your question and the responses that were raised here. and it's open. I mean, anyone else can.
No, but I'm not, sorry. Sorry, I'm trying to put the video on and I don't succeed. Thank you very much. I realize it's a very, very complex situation. I live in South Africa and I come from Romania. I was born in Romania and now live for many years. And so I am someone who has some inside knowledge of both systems. I'm aware of the legacy of what was called socialism, and it was called that. It wasn't called anything else, and people understand that words matter, and you can't simply do away with words, say that was not socialism. In fact, there's quite a widespread attitude regarding, in academic circles. I'm at University of Durban, UKZN, that socialism, the theory still holds, that whatever happened in Eastern Europe for half a century was a mistake, was not really socialism. Unfortunately, people living there, that was their life, and they attach the term to the life. So it's very complicated to explain to people on the street that it was not socialism. And now we know what socialism is. And as Zoltan said before, people are trying to catch up with the West, because for 50 years, the economies were not working properly. In fact, they became bankrupt. That's why the system failed in 1989. So the first impulse was to look west and to imitate the West, because what happened coming from the East, it's still happening currently, was not desirable. So I'm very aware of this. And I'm also aware of what's going on in the South, and I'm going to ask my husband, Professor Chapman from UKZN, to say something in this regard about the Global South.
Yeah, I would not glamorize the so-called Global South. In the first place, a Global South, just as Eastern Europe, is not a single block. It has many facets to it. The latest disgrace is the extension of BRICS from Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa to include the odious regimes of Iran and Saudi Arabia. The South, if you want to use a term, let's use BRICS. BRICS seems to be, its main coherence is to give the finger to the West, its old colonial masters, as it still sees. Unfortunately, the West remains South Africa's main trading partner. So it has to watch out, because next thing it'll be thrown out of the preferential trade agreement with the United States. It's willing to trade the West for a new master, China, holding on to China's tail strings while it holds out the begging bowl. The South African economy was an odious economy under apartheid. It's become now a corrupt economy under a so-called free country. So the word decoloniality is very imprecise, and it is taken up by Walter Mignolo's project in the United States. Behind that project is the old story, the hateful capitalism. If you got rid of that, everything would be okay. And I would suggest that the people in this project look east with far more greater scrutiny before simply trotting out what often comes across to me anyway as a woke imitation of American college kind of graduate talk. Anyway, unfortunately, as I say, South Africa, you try to bring it up and they don't know whether to. It's easier to talk about Africa than to talk about South Africa, because it sits with one foot in the West, one foot in Africa, and it's neither one or the other. Often called a problem child and avoided at conferences. So my opinion, looking from down here at what I've just heard, really, I mean, I've been to Eastern Europe. You can't just gloss away and start talking about some vague idea of socialism that now was a panacea. None of these systems are panaceas, whether it's capitalist or socialist. And certainly centralized economies in China are not panaceas either. Thank you.
Thank you. Cici, do you want to raise your question here with us?
No, thank you. I think I'm flowing with the presenters. Thank you.
Thank you. Does any one of you want to engage with Professor Demetrio and Professor Chapman?
Chapman.
Yes, I would like, if I may. Well, I will just be very brief. As I said, I think it is very important who do we think with? And in these terms, I absolutely agree that we should be very careful about whom we think with. But for example, regarding South African context, I am very grateful, for example, for the lectures of Professor Lwazi Lushaba, who made his lectures available online, because I learned, for example, about Chabani Mangani, whom I didn't know about. There are, of course, other actors in South Africa whom I very much admire, like the Black House Collective and many other people who are actually engaging in decolonial thinking. I don't think that decoloniality or decolonial thinking is or should be so kind of limited, let's say, to one's positionality, but it has to take one's positionality into account. But what I feel about decoloniality, of a kind of an opportunity about decoloniality, actually to open up this space for example, some dialogues that otherwise would not be possible. And just to say one thing, I don't think that any of us is kind of idealizing or kind of making some kind of monolithic blocks out of the socialist past. On the contrary, we are trying, at least I'm talking on my behalf, we are actually trying to fight for our rights to have access to certain ideas, values, and let's say just documents, archives, knowledges from the past, and to judge for ourselves whether this kind of bears any kind of significance for our lives today. So thank you very much.
Yeah, Zoltan, please. And then Zhivka.
Thank you so much. We could talk hours about this because this is a very general question. We're talking about decoloniality, and we're trying to figure out how this relates to the region and how we can make something out of it as a progressive politics move forward. My work is basically about the relationship between Eastern Europe and the global South and how to look outside the West. So I've been trying to do this in my work. And I agree that I think that we have to be sensible and affectionate towards different historical experiences, right? So they carry a lot of emotional and a lot of trauma and a lot of feelings. But the best way forward is through constructing ways of dialogue and trying not to make moral monologues. This is often that people do on Twitter, or they try a university project of decolonizing the university. And often I find that it is more like a monologue and not like building a dialogue with different geographical contexts. And when it comes to socialist decoloniality, I think we should not be reproducing Cold War political identifications as a moral compass, but we should try to understand the actual, different modes of structural integration into the world economy. So as I said, in this perspective, race and coloniality were modes and articulations of strategies of structural articulation. So when you look at this from this perspective, first of all, you can see that sometimes decoloniality as a political project from some positions are not really emancipative at all. But sometimes they lead to various other issues. Think of the fact that in the Indian nationalism, for example, or the fact that how nationalism and various fascist ideas have been exported after the Second World War to decolonization projects. Or we could think about the Hungarian context. So in many cases, these articulations of Hungarian being colonized by the West are, very long-term histories. Without understanding these histories, we are blind to actually criticizing the actual dynamics, strategies, and also the politics of how these political powers are trying to construct alternative decolonialisms or hijacking decolonial politics. In the Hungarian case, it is largely about maneuvering in a very changing world economy, trying to show economic allegiances to Russia, but also to China, but still maintaining to be in the European camp and proving that we are actually the better, white Europeans than those in the West. This is actually something which is not new. These are recurring identifications and articulations of racial positions and colonial identities, which have been there 100 years ago, or maybe 200 years ago. So my approach as a global historian is actually to uncover these histories in order to, inform us about the structural conditions of how these articulations emerge and how to construct an anti-colonial, anti-racist politics, which can only be global. So you cannot do this in just Eastern Europe. So I don't think that our lexicon is about re-essentializing, the Eastern European position or voice. It's just about contesting the West-centric hegemony of this concept and trying to open up to other regions.
Thank you, Zhivka.
Thank you. And I will just add something about the kind of the study of socialism, which we are very much, some of us engaged in. And as I want to say about my own work of kind of how do I approach socialist history as sort of as a it is a historical period. It is a historical fact that, and a historical experience that is very messy and should be critiqued. And but first and foremost, I want to kind of approach it on its own terms and develop an internal critique and from within, and what would a critique of socialism from within look like? And I think it looks very different from what Western sort of imaginaries of the socialist period in Eastern Europe are telling us it was. So first and foremost, I want to insist that we kind of researchers from Eastern Europe speak about the East European experience on our own terms and develop our own critiques. And this is not to say to excuse the socialist governments, and they were all also terrible and in so many ways. But first, I want to call for this kind of immanent internal critique, and which is very important. And also, if you look at it, just kind of open it in the period in its complexity, and it's also kind of in its historical development. I mean, what is Bulgarian socialism versus Soviet socialism versus Hungarian socialism or Yugoslavian socialism? These are very different kind of projects and experiences, but also they have their own historical development. So that kind of to account for this historical development, Bulgarian socialism from socialism in the 70s and the 80s, and so that is to kind of recover the dynamism and the complexity, and then, as Zoltan is saying, to sort of to trace and understand the sort of the structural relations that governed its ties with other countries globally, and the global economy, and so that's what I wanted to say about this. And I mean, and when we think about this, we can't talk about socialism just in general. We can talk about these very concrete sort of contexts and situations and periods, yes. So that's I'll just stop here.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes left, so. And Aaron, if you want to share your thoughts with regard to the questions raised or anything else before we end. No? Okay. Before thanking you all for being here and sharing your important research and book with us, whatever, this can be said, and you all know that whether we choose to call this process decoloniality, or engage in other fields as Manuela was doing with the, going back to Eduardo Glissant's idea of the question of imagination as being politically motivated. And the question of archive, as Anna was raising. So decoloniality in this case would be, if we would accept that knowledge dominates, language is the engine of transmission of knowledge into our bodies and our psyches, then decoloniality would be the way to really enter that field and challenge the worlds that are shaped and that we inhabit through that epistemology. So the epistemic domination. And it is in this context that I was raising this question of decoloniality, or anything else that had been done previously. But it is an important book, and I hope that you all continue in this process. I am not a decoloniality scholar myself, but it is a scientific field, and I engage it as I engage any other scientific fields. And I want to thank you all and for making time, for being with us. And I hope that we get together again in future with the next volume. Thank you so much. And ciao.
Thank you.
Thank you.